goes to show what you can do when you invite young people, early career people and students into the fold. They can, in many cases, they really stick around and get involved. And in my case, almost ever since then, I've been involved in some capacity on the board or in some committee. And I've served as a president of Division 32 back in 2013 and 2014. And I've been involved in this conference, the annual conference, since it started with David Kane. So I went to the first conference. I remember Lewis Hoffman, another former president who wasn't, who was also early career at that time, and Todd Dubose, who's incoming president. The three of us and John Raskin, who's the current president, were all there. And I remember us going out to lunch at what is it, In-N-Out Burger in California, and and just goofing around and laughing the whole time and having a blast. And then David Kane that year literally got on his knees and begged me to take over as chair of the conference because nobody wanted to do it, I think. And I didn't really want to do it either, but because it's a lot of work. But I did, and did that for a long time. And the beauty of all that is that we now have a whole group of new energy that's come into the division. I think a lot, by and large, because of the annual conference. And people now on the board who are running things that are bringing all kinds of fresh ideas and more diversity to the community. And I think we're very blessed by that. So, and that includes Vanessa Brown and Roxanne, who are wonderful, wonderful colleagues who have been around for a long time, and I've gotten to know at conferences where we have a lot of fun. So for those of you who I haven't seen in a while, great to see you again. For those of you who are new, great to meet you. So I'm going to talk today about the joyful life. And let me give you a little bit of a background on that. I actually did my dissertation on the phenomenology of joy. And that was a long time ago. I hate to admit it, but maybe for some of you, it might not seem that long ago, but I defended my dissertation in 2003. And really started that research early on. I think it was like 1990. It wasn't even 2000 yet. It was 1999 or something like that I started doing that research, and defended it in 2003. So I've spent my career researching a variety of things, but always coming back to this question of joy. And I started off studying joy as an emotional state. And more recently, I've returned to the study of joy as a kind of disposition, as a kind of existential condition, a kind of way of living, a kind of style of living, you might say. And looking at that qualitatively, but also quantitatively. So in many ways, what I'm giving you here is a sort of an overview of the work I've been doing all these years, about 25 years now, I guess. And summarizing that. Now, having said that, well, I'll come back around to that issue. But I just want to say that the way this is going to be set up is I'm going to kind of talk a little bit about some of the background, the existential and humanistic and spiritual traditions and how they understand joy. And then I'm going to get into some of the empirical research after. But we're going to have a chance in between to do an experiential exercise and discussion along the way. And then I think we'll have time at the end also to have an extended discussion if everything times out the way that I plan. But I think we're supposed to spend about an hour and a half doing presentation, about a half hour in discussion. So that's going to be somewhat spread out throughout the presentation. So let me put my PowerPoint up. Okay, can everybody see that all right? Okay, so the title of the presentation is The Joyful Life, an Existential Humanistic Critique of Positive Psychology. And how do I advance this? Okay, there we go. So here's a quick outline of what I'm going to be covering. So I'm going to start off contrasting or comparing and contrasting conceptions conceptions of happiness and conceptions of joy, drawing from existential, humanistic, and spiritual perspectives. Then I'm going to look at positive psychology 2.0 as developed by Paul Wong, which is more congruent with the existential, humanistic, and spiritual perspectives, and his taxonomy of visions of the good life or happiness in terms of hedonic, prudential, eudaimonic, and chaironic approaches. And then we'll look at an existential humanistic critique of positive psychology. We'll have a chance to do a little bit of a drawing exercise that I think will help you sort of personally connect with the qualitative research that we're going to be exploring when we look at the phenomenology of trait joy. I mean, of not trait joy, but state joy. And then we're going to look at the phenomenology of trait joy. And then that becomes the basis for some quantitative research on joy using the joyful life scale that I've developed. And then we're going to look at some of the research that flows out of that. So the relationship between the joyful life scale, or the JLS, and some humanistic and positive psychological constructs, the reliability and validity of that scale. And then some recent research that's hot off the press with looking at the relationship between the joyful life scale, blood pressure, and pain using a cold pressure technique. And I'll tell you about some of the promising results that are coming out of that research. And then we'll talk a little bit about the clinical applications and directions for future research. And I think there'll be plenty of time for discussion and conversation around that. Okay, so before I launch into talking about existential, humanistic, and spiritual considerations of joy, I think Johnson, in a special issue of Journal of Positive Psychology, makes a really useful distinction here about the 4 levels of analysis, really when you're talking about any kind of emotion, but here specifically, Johnson is talking about mood. He says that one level of analysis is emotion. So here we're talking about, he defines this as a sort of perception of a good or positive circumstance. So it's really about a particular moment in time. Moods are more transcendent of particular circumstances. They tend to infuse a whole situation, or maybe a day or a week or a month. So there's an overall mood that seems to be characterize an extended period of time. And then there's an even more extended sense of joy or emotion, which is where it becomes a trait. It becomes a tendency or a disposition to be oriented toward that emotional state, in this case, joy. And we see this a lot in research on personality, where you'll take something that's an emotional state like gratitude, for example, and then research on gratitude gets extended to personality research. So you get, dispositional gratitude, right, or the grateful disposition, for example, and similar kinds of traits. Or you think about even in the DSM, you can have states of anxiety, but when states of anxiety are persistent, chronic, and debilitating, then they become understood as a trait. And then lastly, which I think is an interesting addition that I hadn't seen in the literature, except maybe in some of my work, until Johnson, and this was just this past year, he talks about another level of analysis where he talks about joy as a spiritual fruit. And this is coming out of a variety of spiritual traditions that I'm going to outline. But here, joy is understood as a kind of transcendence, a kind of sense of timelessness or resiliency despite one's circumstances. So there's a kind of sense of joy despite the circumstances of one's life. And I think this idea of a spiritual fruit, I think, is really consistent with some of what we're going to see in the existential, humanistic, and spiritual traditions. And it's distinguishable from the way maybe joy has been understood in a lot of research up until that point. Okay. So let's talk about joy versus happiness. In the existential and humanistic approaches, there has been a pretty consistent attempt to tease apart or distinguish between what might be called sort of fleeting, hedonic, a more superficial kind of pleasure or pursuit of enjoyment, as opposed to an enduring sense of what we might call an existential or spiritual joy. And one of the clearest articulations of this distinction is found in Rollo May, which I think he really kind of got from Paul Tillich. And he talks about joy as a sheer delight in possibility, or delight in sheer possibility, as opposed to happiness as this search for hedonic pleasure in the moment. So joy is a sense in which one could discover an opportunity for joy in any moment, no matter what one's circumstances, by sort of being open to the dizzying possibility of the moment, right? As a kind of joy in a kind of freedom, you might say. And whereas happiness as a hedonic search is like more superficial, it's fleeting, it's maybe there's less agency to it. It's you're except for looking for something external to give you that sense of pleasure. In Maslow, he doesn't use the term joy, but I think if you look at his descriptions of self-actualization, there's a lot of overlap with themes of joy that appear in the research literature and some of the phenomenological research that I've done. But I think in particular, in 1969, when Maslow wrote a paper called Varieties of Transcendence, that's a great paper, very short, it's full text online if you want to look it up. But I think if you look through that Varieties of Transcendence by Maslow, those themes, every theme of transcendence that he lays out there, I think you can see repeated in a lot of the research I'm going to be talking about today. I don't have time to outline the whole thing, but I think the key here is that self-transcendence is something that Maslow developed later in his work on self-actualization, just prior to his death. And that 1969 article is a good example of it. And he was particularly influenced by Viktor Frankl. It was really Frankl who was working on Maslow to try to get him to articulate this, that this idea of self-actualization is ironically not about the self. It's actually these deficiency motivations where we become more concerned about the self. I'm concerned about my safety, right? Concerned about my physiological needs, my hunger, my thirst. I'm concerned about my social status, or concerned about whatever my esteem. All of that, whether it's a narcissistic need or a social need, all those needs are primarily egoistic. They're necessary, they're needed to build up a resiliency that can lead to self-actualization. But interestingly, self-actualization, ironically, seems to be primarily characterized by a kind of self-transcendence, a kind of losing of oneself in something other than oneself, being for others, being invested in community, being generative. And this sort of transcendent quality, I think, is very interesting because it's something we see in joy as well. There's an interesting kind of self-forgetting that we see in joy, rather than a kind of absorption, a kind of narcissistic preoccupation that seems to be important. And then, of course, we see this in Viktor Frankl as well as this emphasis on how a meaningful life, really in some ways similar to the way Maslow talks about self-actualization, isn't disposed toward homeostasis. The sort of deficit needs that Maslow talked about are things that you can get satiated. Like if you're hungry, you can sit down and eat a meal, and then you're not hungry anymore, right? So you're not looking for food anymore. You can rest for a while. But self-actualization is distinguished from deficit needs because those self-actualization doesn't get satiated. You're never tired of being self-actualized. When you're pursuing scientific endeavors because you're looking for truth, or when you're engaged in activities in activism because you desire justice, that you don't get tired of that, right? That doesn't get satiated. Those kinds of transcendent kind of pursuits beyond ourselves at the self-actualization level are really pursuit of meaning. They're not about getting homeostasis, but a kind of tension that comes from a will to meaning. And Frankl sees this as a kind of existential or spiritual dimension of transcendence that I think is very close to what I understand by the joyful life, a kind of joyful life oriented toward self-transcendence and self-actualization. So that's a very brief snapshot of some humanistic distinctions between happiness and joy. But I think we can really dig deep into this distinction by turning to Heidegger. Martin Heidegger and his existential philosophy has been very influential within humanistic and existential and phenomenological approaches, because he's one of the seminal thinkers, along with Edmund Husserl and Maurice Merleau-Ponty and Jean-Paul Sartre and Emmanuel Levinas and others. And a lot of people don't realize that Heidegger had a theory of joy. In fact, that's why I decided to do my dissertation on joy. And in order to understand Heidegger's theory of joy, we have to understand how he understands mood, what we could very roughly translate as mood, but in German, it's Befindlichkeit. I'm probably mangling the German pronunciation of that. I had a student in my class who spoke German. When I was teaching Heidegger, she would laugh at all my pronunciations of the German. So apologies for the bad German pronunciation, but it's something like Befindlichkeit, right? And this is translated into English as state of mind or mood. And one way of thinking about this, which I got from Eugene Genlin primarily, is that Befindlichkeit, a good translation or a better translation of Befindlichkeit into English, is finding oneself. It's how you're finding oneself. So think about, you're going about your day, you come upon somebody who you're friendly with, and you say, how are you? How are you doing? Right? The answer, the authentic answer, not a superficial platitude, but an authentic answer to that question about how you're doing would be your Befindlichkeit, right? Your mood. So there are aspects of Befindlichkeit, three aspects of Befindlichkeit, three dimensions. It involves a kind of reflexivity, right? Because it's how we find ourselves. Most of the time for Heidegger, we're engaged in activity. We're actively engaged. We're absorbed in everyday life. And most of that is unreflective, right? So finding oneself requires a sort of moment of reflexivity, right? You have to sort of catch yourself in your projects, in your meaningful engagement in projects, and in that reflexivity we find ourselves. And then what gives us insight into how we're doing is our feelings, on the one hand, and our situation. So how we're situated within the projects that we're engaged in, how those projects are going, and how we're feeling about them, and our reflexivity on all that gives rise to Befindlichkeit or mood. Okay, so a couple important points here. These are more philosophical points, if you'll indulge me a little bit, but it's important to understand in Heidegger that this is not a subjective experience. It's an ontological category. It's more primordial or more fundamental than the epistemological distinction between subject and object. He's saying that our concept of subject and object is secondary or derivative from this primary existential disclosiveness or revealing that happens through mood. He says a mood comes before philosophy in a certain sense. He's trying to articulate something that happens before the distinction between subject and object. It's not a passive experience, but a finding of ourselves in the context of significance, in which our projects are going well or badly. And this is more primordial than distinctions between cognition and emotion, or the self-contained self and other. I teach in an APA accredited program. Well, it's accredited on contingency. And when we were going through our process of applying at PointPark, they have two different aspects of the program, two different foundational or fundamental areas of interest that need to be covered, in cognition and emotion, and then a number of others. But when I was teaching my class, because I come from this more phenomenological approach, cognition and emotion were fused together and integrated throughout the course. And when we had our site visitor come in, they found that unacceptable. We had to cover cognition separately from emotion. I found that a little bit oppressive, but I accommodated because, of course, we needed to have APA accreditation. But the point here is that there's a kind of ideological presupposition in a lot of research in psychology that there's this stuff called cognition going on in the human being, and there's this stuff called emotion, and somehow those are two different things. Heidegger problematizes that whole distinction, as well as the phenomenological tradition. as well as this notion that we have a sort of interior private self, and then there are other people that are interior private selves. All of that is subject to critical reflection. So we have to kind of problematize all that. I don't have time, of course, to get into all the details behind this, but I just want to highlight that, you know, what's exciting about phenomenology is how it goes back and it questions some of the most fundamental things that we take for granted in psychology and everyday life, and thinks about them at a deeper level than we're used to thinking. And I think for me, that's one of the things that's very exciting about it. Okay, so what do moods reveal, right? So the idea here for Heidegger is that moods are disclosive. They reveal something. They reveal what? Well, our thrownness. And what Heidegger means about that is how we're finding ourselves in the moment, you know, on the way from the past towards the future. So the present is always this kind of rupture within which where there's a retention, as Husserl would say, of the past and a protension of the future. So there's not, he doesn't have sort of a clock time way of, a linear perspective way of understanding time, like a clock. Time, you know, the past, future, and the present are there in every moment, right? As this recollection and anticipation that happens in every burst of experience, every outburst of world that we have at any particular moment. And so thrownness is this sense in which we're thrown into this sort of ecstatic experience of time, and then catch ourselves in that reflectively as being thrown. Having already, thrownness means we're always already in the midst of a world with a past and a future in the present. And it's a world of concern, which means we're engaged in projects, right? We're engaged in tools, with technologies, with activities that precede us, right? So going to the dentist is the example I like to use. When we go to the dentist office, there's a certain equipmentality to the dentist office. When you go into the waiting room, you know that there's a certain kind of script that you follow. You know, you go to up to the window and you say, "Hey, I'm here for my appointment," and they say, "Okay, we'll come. You know, we'll let you know. Maybe you have to sign a few things." And then they say, "We'll come and get you when it's time for your appointment." And then you go sit down and maybe read a magazine. Usually they have magazines, and then they let you in. And there's a chair that you sit in and tools that they use in your mouth, and you kind of know the drill because there's a certain world of the dentist's office. There's an equipmentality that precedes us and even precedes the dentists who live there. It's like they've been trained and have become part of this world of dentistry, and we're entering into their world of dentistry as a participant, as a patient. So in that sense, everything we do, whether we're at home, whether we're at work, whether we're at play, there's a field of equipmentality that sort of prescribes a certain significance to our lives and that precedes us and will exist after us. And within that world, within a particular world, it's situated within being itself as a whole. What's interesting about Heidegger is being never directly reveals itself. It always is concealing itself indirectly through revealing beings. But being itself is revealed, he believes, through mood. But as I'll explain, only certain kinds of moods reveal being and other moods conceal being. And the other thing about mood in Heidegger or Befindlichkeit is moods reveal what's important, what he calls mattering, what's at stake, what's important at a particular moment in time. So if I'm at the dentist office and the dentist is working on my teeth, and then I hear like a weird noise, and he goes, "Oh, oops," you know what I mean? At that moment, I go, I start to panic, right? What is that mood revealing, right? That something is at stake, you know, the well-being of my teeth, right? So in that very simple kind of concrete sense, moods reveal all of these things. And Heidegger understands mood as co-existential with human existence, the human existential categories of understanding and fallenness. Understanding being this projection into the future. It's the way we construct the meaning of events and outline projects within which we're engaged and orient ourselves toward possibilities. And then fallenness is this tendency to be absorbed in our activities, to be oriented and interested in beings, possibilities, and to be forgetful of being itself. Okay, so that's a lot to take in, but it's a very short snapshot of Heidegger. Now, all of that gives us an entry point into what I think is the most important point to understand joy here, is Heidegger's concept of the ontological structure of moods. So he says any mood or any Befindlichkeit has three dimensions. So there's the before what of the mood. It's that before which we're having a mood. So in this case, it's what matters, right? It's the being with which we are concerned. So for example, in the mood of fear, it's the fearsome that is the before what. I'm fearful before the fearsome, the rabid dog, or the fire that's broken out in my house, or the weird noise that the dentist makes in my mouth, right? Those moments, those concrete events are the aboutness of the fear. They're what the intentionality of fear is directed towards. And then there's the mood itself, and the mood itself is the disclosure of the different ways in which beings in the world can matter. And then finally, there's the about what of mood. So the human being is always the about what, right? So when I'm in a state of fear, I'm fearful about the fire in my house, but the fear is about human existence. It's about me, right? Because I'm afraid of the fire because it threatens my safety in my life. So mood always references Dasein, what Heidegger calls Dasein, or the human kind of being or human existence. So the human being is who is threatened by the fearsome in the mood of fear. So one way of thinking about this is it's similar to the way Edmund Husserl talks about intentionality. So any mood has an intentional structure, right? There's a noetic side, right, which is Dasein or the human existence, or not. Remember, we want to avoid subjectivity language, but it maybe is more along the lines of what we would conventionally call subjectivity. And then there's the before what, the object, so to speak, which is what we're afraid of. And then the mood itself is disclosive of those two poles of intentionality, the noetic and the noematic, if you're familiar with Edmund Husserl. Okay, so jumping ahead, now that gives us a framework for making, I think, a very useful distinction between authentic and inauthentic moods. So for Heidegger, what distinguishes these two, by the way, this is not a moral statement. He's not saying authentic moods are morally better than inauthentic moods, and you should avoid inauthentic moods and have authentic moods. Sometimes the concept of authenticity is used that way in existential psychology, but that in the case of Heidegger, that would be a misunderstanding. He's really understanding it more epistemologically as a way, or really ontologically, as a way that moods can disclose things or conceal things. He's not saying that concealing things through mood is bad. He's just saying for his project of trying to understand being, authentic moods are useful because they reveal something that inauthentic moods conceal. So authentic moods are disclosive of what? Being in the world. Whereas inauthentic moods conceal being in the world. What does that mean? Well, let's look at anxiety as an example. So when I'm in a state of anxiety, the before what of anxiety, in contrast to fear, is not about a particular entity. It's not about the fearsome, but human being itself is the before what of fear. So the human being in the state of anxiety isn't threatened by a particular being in the world, but by being in the world itself. In other words, human existence itself provokes anxiety. And that reveals something. It reveals human existence in a way that's normally concealed in an inauthentic mood. Fear conceals the about what of the fear. Anxiety reveals what the about what is. Human existence. And Heidegger would move on and say, in particular, our being toward death, right? That we could die at any moment, that we're vulnerable, that we're mortal. Okay, so once we understand this distinction between fear and anxiety, then we can take that as a structure that can also be applied to joy. And this is done back in 1981 by a philosopher named Quentin Smith, where he makes an argument, a very compelling argument, that's, I think, very consistent with Heidegger in Being and Time, that joy, like anxiety, is an authentic Befindlichkeit. It reveals being as opposed to concealing being. And I think this is really interesting because I think it's a very common assumption that Heidegger is a philosopher of anxiety, a philosopher of angst, and a lot of existential psychology gets understood in this way. When I teach existential psychology in my classes, I use the movie Harold and Maude. How many of you have seen the movie Harold and Maude? Seen that? Yeah, it's a great movie if you haven't seen it. But I think this is a really good sort of example of what I'm trying to get at. I would say like Harold, you know, in his sort of immaturity and his preoccupation with death, has a kind of inauthentic relationship to death, right? You know, he's sort of morbidly preoccupied with dying, kind of fakes death in order to get a rise out of his mother and get attention from his mother, who's a pretty self-absorbed person. And then he meets Maud, who is someone who's really kind of accepted her mortality at, you know, who's about to turn 80, and who sort of adopts this young boy, Harold, as a kind of mentee, you know, mentees him into a good life. And in an interesting way, Maud has a kind of authentic relationship to death that gives her this kind of vitality, a kind of joy, you know, and Ruth Gordon, you know, really embodies that as a, you know, fantastic performance of that character. So that's kind of maybe gives you some, you know, anchors it in a film, in a film narrative and some characters. But I think that existential psychology is more about Maud than it is about Harold. It's not, you know, it's not a morbid preoccupation with death. It's about a relationship to our mortality that gives us this greater vitality that comes from an acceptance of our mortality. But Heidegger was not just interested in anxiety. He talks about joy. He talks about despair. He talks about boredom and other moods. In Being in Time, if you just go and get a copy, if you have Being in Time on your shelf, or you go to the bookstore, I would challenge you to open up the book Being in Time and just flip through the pages and look for the bolded text, because you'll only find one bolded text in the entire book. And it's right here. It's on page 310 if you're looking at the McQuarrie and Robinson translation. Heidegger says, with sober anxiety, which brings one before one's individual ability to be, there goes an unshakable joy in this possibility. Right? So the one bolded text in the entire book is about joy, what he calls unshakable joy. So he's saying that he's interested in anxiety, right? This kind of authentic Befindlichkeit, because it's authentic, it reveals being, but also that existentially, it's transformative. It opens up a kind of unshakable joy, and unshakable is interesting, right? It implies a kind of enduring disposition, right? A kind of trait, you might say, a disposition to be joyful that comes through moving toward rather than fleeing from our anxiety. So this is going to be important for our analysis. But I think I want to lay out a few more things on Heidegger before I move on, is that we can make a distinction between authentic joy and a kind of inauthentic happiness, or what Quentin Smith calls gladness. So you could say the how one is of joy is a kind of being fulfilled, according to Quentin Smith. In other words, the way of mattering of joy is having a sense of being fulfilled. And that fortunateness is the way of mattering that reveals how being in the world is attuned to the that it is, or rather than it is not, of human existence, which has the character of a gift. So to put this in plainer terms, what joy reveals is that human existence is, right? It didn't have to be, you know, it's an answer to that question, why is there something rather than nothing? The most fundamental answer to that question is that it simply is. It's this kind of rupture or openness of existence that didn't have to be, and it has a character of a gift in the sense that being gives over existence, gives over being, and then recedes, hiding itself, concealing itself. So we don't know what being is. There's a tendency in metaphysics, to try to define being with a capital B in terms of some entity, whether that's God or the natural world or whatever, or the elements, if you go back to the ancient Greeks. And Heidegger is saying that being conceals itself, and that the best way to be attuned to being is not to sort of transform it into any particular kind of entity, but just to be open to it as a pure gift. And that is characterized by fortunateness by Quentin Smith, and he thinks that this is uniquely revealed in states of joy. So to contrast joy with gladness, we can go back to anxiety and fear, right? So anxiety is about disclosing how human being is thrown into the world, and fear is about disclosing the fearsome, a particular entity. And joy is about disclosing human existence as a gift for which it's grateful, in contrast to happiness or gladness, which means disclosing a being or a possibility for which we're glad. He's saying it's not that happiness is bad, immoral, or unethical. It just doesn't disclose being. It doesn't reveal our fortunateness in Quentin Smith's terms. Okay, so that's a much more detailed analysis based in Heidegger. We can also look to spiritual traditions, and I think we see some interesting parallels here to Heidegger's analysis, but within the context of different kinds of religious, sort of bona fide religious traditions. The dominant world religions are the ones that I'm going to cover, although this is not an adequate representation of any of these particular traditions or all of the religious traditions that could be represented. I'm just covering the major ones. Rabbi Alfred Moses, back in 1920, talks about how joy is a fruit of the recognition of the goodness of God's creation in the Jewish tradition. And it's a recognition that man is made in the image of God, and the fulfillment of the living God within the self through faith. Yitzhak Buxheim in 2002, within the Hasidic tradition, talks about how the Jewish mystics say that the ultimate aim is to attain the bliss that God intends for us. And Shekinah, or indwelling of God's presence, is everywhere. And it's through loving awareness of this indwelling, of this presence, that we're able to experience divakut, or divine joy. Buxheim says that one can never find permanent happiness in impermanent pleasures. Only divine joy is eternal and unchanging, because it manifests and reveals the inner truth of the human soul. Within the Christian tradition, joy is typically understood as a transformative experience in which suffering and despair are substituted for celebration and gratitude through the grace of God. In Hebrews, the letter to the Hebrews, chapter 12, Paul says that the discipline of virtue necessitates pain and suffering, but that this agony will be transformed into joy by the peaceful fruit of righteousness to those who are trained in it. So there's already kind of a sense of the virtue tradition here, right? This idea that suffering or toil leads to wisdom and the cultivation of virtue, and it's a byproduct of that cultivation of virtue that people experience joy. And so enduring joy isn't going to be found by sort of attaching ourselves to fleeting pleasure, but is only a feature of a flourishing life, a life lived well and it goes well, says Moltmann in his 2015 article. Within the Islamic tradition, we find a similar kind of parallel where hedonic happiness is seen to be momentary, superficial, and it's represented by the Arabic farah, the brief enjoyment of those who rejoice in the life of this world. Whereas an enduring state of joy is designated in Arab as sada, which can be found only in the presence of God. So I think so far we see this common refrain where these momentary sort of hedonic fleeting pleasures are something that will ultimately not lead to an enduring sense of being fulfilled, but there's this other kind of happiness, which is an orientation towards the divine, but within Heidegger, that would be understood as being with a capital B, right? Not necessarily, a theistic view, but not necessarily not a theistic view. Heidegger says he refuses to answer the question of theism versus atheism or agnosticism. He says that question comes later after a more thorough interrogation of being. And he says, we don't yet understand being. And until we understand being, we can't answer the question of theism. There's a great paper. I would say if you want to read more about that, Heidegger, check out his letter on humanism, which is his response to Jean-Paul Sartre's misunderstanding of being and time. There's a great translation by Miles Groth, which is up on the, that you can find in a Google search. Okay, so let's look to the East. Those are the Western traditions in the Middle East. But within the Buddhist tradition in particular, we can look to the Mattanasama Sutta, where joy is designated as mudita. And mudita is one of the four boundless qualities or four Brahma dwellings which lead to enlightenment. And there are three other Brahma dwellings, which are equanimity, love, and compassion. And those other qualities, other than joy, are important for liberating the ego from its limits, right? It's about what I'll refer to later in joy as a kind of breaking open of the ego. Joy, or mudita, is understood as a rejoicing in all beings who are freed from suffering. So I think this is a really interesting, it's a little bit different than some of the Western traditions, where joy isn't really about, God per se, but it is about otherness. It's about the other rejoicing in the other, freed from their egoic limitations and liberated from suffering. And that this is seen as a state of mind that's necessary for the culmination of the final Buddha wisdom, where intention is translated into action. Each of these could be a presentation in and of itself, right? And then we still would probably feel like we've done an inadequate job. Okay, so Paul Wong has been, like I have and other people have been critical of positive psychology and it's sort of the tyranny of the positive, as Barbara Held would say, or, it's sometimes trivial happyology, as Richard Lazarus called it, right? There's a kind of, there's a lack of nuance or distinction between all these varieties of conceptions of happiness. That started to change over the years. I think those critiques are starting to have an impact within positive psychology. And one of those places is in Paul Wong, who's drawing from the existential and humanistic tradition. He's especially influenced by Viktor Frankl, and he's articulating what he calls a positive psychology 2.0, which has to begin with a clear taxonomy of the varieties of perspectives on the good life that are available. So this is his particular taxonomy, but I think it's a really good one. And he makes a distinction between hedonic, prudential, eudaimonic, and chironic conceptions of the good life. So a hedonic conception of the good life is, as we've been suggesting all along, it's really about the ratio of pleasure to pain. Merely being satisfied with the circumstances of one's life. So in this case, your mood or your emotions are sort of at the whims of, what's happening in your life, things beyond your control. It's think of it as you're, a little dinging out in the sea, just sort of battered around by the weather. That's sort of the hedonic view. Then there's the Prudential View, which is a bit different than hedonic in that it emphasizes a kind of agentic quality, a kind of active engagement with the world, the pursuit of achievements, goals. And this is, I think, for Wong, a kind of step forward, a little bit less superficial than a hedonic, but it lacks a moral or ethical dimension. It's, you could theoretically be a sociopath and be, highly prudential in your pursuit of happiness, right? You're very actively engaged in victimizing people, right? Does that mean you're living a good life? That's why we need the eudaimonic approach. So the eudaimonic approach is similar to the prudential approach in that it emphasizes activity engagement, but it understands activity engagement as sort of shaped by character, or virtue, or excellence, which enables us to take those dispositions and organize them in relationship to a moral or ethical sense of the good beyond ourselves. So a person living a eudaimonic happiness would be someone who's utilizing the range of personal strengths and dispositions in the service of the common good, in the service of the other, as well as the self. And then the chironic, I haven't come across this conception of the chironic except in Paul Wong, and when I read it, it was like light bulbs really went off, because it was really resonating with the other stuff that I was studying in the existential and spiritual traditions. So this chironic sense of happiness, Wong also recognizes is congruent with these existential, humanistic, and spiritual approaches, because there's an accent on an appreciation of one's fortune, a sense of awe or gratitude about the blessing or gift of life. You can see that in Heidegger's analysis and Quentin Smith's sort of appropriation of Heidegger. And the important thing here is that this sense of life as a gift, a sense of awe before the mystery of existence as a sort of wellspring for joy, is something that's not about, mere, superficial sort of and fleeting sort of pleasure, right? It requires almost a kind of exception or an appreciation of life in all of its complexity, through all of its triumphs and all of its tragedies. And I think implied here is that it wouldn't involve a kind of defensive avoidance of suffering, right? But maybe even a radical kind of acceptance of suffering as an opportunity for growth, for wisdom. And in Greek tragedy, they talk about pathemathema, I think, in the Greek. And pathemathema is wisdom through suffering, right? It's through catharsis. That's what catharsis originally meant, is this process of coming to a breakthrough, right? A moment of insight that blesses our lives through suffering rather than avoiding suffering. Okay, so again, I want to give some props to Paul Wong in Positive Psychology 2.0. He talks about a meaning orientation to the good life and contrasts this with a happiness perspective. And I think this, again, is a useful distinction. So when he talks about a meaning orientation, that's very consistent with what I understand by the joyful life. It integrates both eudaimonic and chironic visions of the good life in line with the existential, humanistic, and spiritual perspectives. And it contrasts with the happiness perspective in that, prudential and hedonic approaches tend to be fairly self-serving. They also tend to avoid pain and challenge. And in contrast, meaning orientation is about actualizing meaning and purpose, about pursuing rightly ordered goods, even if that means personal sacrifice, willing to endure short-term suffering for greater goods beyond the moment. A capacity for delay of gratification, right, is implied here. And a striving for enduring and valuable ends rather than just momentary fleeting pleasures. All right, so I'm going to outline some of the critiques of positive psychology that are coming out of this tradition. So let me first, before I get into the criticisms, just say that there are good things, I think, coming out of the positive psychology tradition. There are opportunities to build bridges with people who are doing research in positive psychology. But I think that there are some obstacles to that. There are some prejudices within positive psychology that make it difficult to have a productive dialogue with humanistic psychology. I'm going to outline some of these, although I could go on and on. But I would say one is there has been, especially among the early framers of positive psychology, Seligman in particular, a failure to really adequately give props to humanistic psychology as really pioneering work on human flourishing. And in that initial 1998 paper that everyone cites in the American Psychologist that he co-wrote with Csikszentmihalyi, instead of really kind of honoring humanistic psychology, he takes the opportunity to really bash it over the head and say some things that are inflammatory and really strawman kind of arguments. And a lot of people have commented on that over the years, including me. And by the way, Seligman recently came out and apologized for that in a recent publication, which is good, but if you read it, it's sort of a half-hearted apology, so not everybody's very satisfied with it. But I think that's a big problem, that it's hard for us to build bridges with positive psychology until they honor that tradition. There's a mutual kind of respect. We're not going to go into a dialogue with people that have contempt for us. You can't have that. You can't have a dialogue with people that have contempt for you. So that has to change, and I think it's beginning to change. The other thing that I think is a big problem, Robbins and Friedman, in the Robbins and Friedman article from 2018, Harrison Friedman and I co-wrote together, that whenever you're talking about the good life, I mean, it should seem patently obvious that this is a value-laden endeavor. You know what I mean? You can't study the good life from a kind of detached or in any kind of objective way, in any traditional epistemological sense of that term. It's a value-laden enterprise. I think humanistic and existential and spiritual traditions don't see a problem with that they see value as infused, that existence itself is value laden, right? So how we engage with those values I think requires to some extent some critical reflection on the subject value, the object value, or the subject-object dichotomy, and how that creates a fact-value dichotomy. That is, I think, phenomenology brings a very formidable critique to that dichotomous way of thinking about facts and values, that I think can help us think about these problems. But my experience is that the positive psychologists aren't remotely open to that conversation. But I'm starting to see some fissures there. There's open, and the Journal of Positive Psychology, just this past year, there was an article that references the paper that I wrote with Harrison and acknowledges that it's time for positive psychology to admit that, positive psychology is a value-laden enterprise. So there seems to be some people, willing to concede that. I think that's promising. That means that we have to be, there has to be a kind of epistemological humility anytime we're doing this research, a recognition that what we're doing is socially and culturally situated and needs to be always in dialogue with a kind of critical reflexivity. The other problem that we have with positive psychology, of course, is it's coming out of a reductive positivistic framework. And whenever you're studying things like happiness and well-being, and you put that through the ringer of reductionism and positivism, usually the only thing you're left with is a kind of superficial and hedonic vision of happiness, because it's really the only kind of happiness that makes sense within a reductive positivistic framework. And that's one of the reasons why, behaviorism and cognitive neuroscience tend to conceptualize happiness at this very basic kind of level, because it's something you can understand very easily on a physiological level. Pleasure and pain are pretty easy to operationalize. Yet when we understand happiness at this very superficial level, we're missing all these other ways of understanding happiness that are outlined by Wong. The other thing that has been pointed out by the self-determination theory folks like Sheldon and Ryan is that measurement of constructs in positive psychology have tended to emphasize external circumstances and extrinsic aims. And what self-determination theory has shown us is that more enduring states of well-being are really about intrinsic aims, right? Things like autonomy, relatedness, those intrinsic aims, rather than external concerns like social status or fame or material acquisition, tend to lead to a lack of fulfillment, temporary, satisfaction, but ultimately leaves us feeling empty. So I think that's a valuable critique as well. And then the other thing I'd like to mention is just when we're looking at things like virtues or traits, I think it's really problematic in the way that Seligman and other people have tried to conceptualize positive strengths and virtues in an isolated way. Is if you can look at a character strength in isolation from all the other traits and call it a virtue. And I think if you go back to the Aristotelian tradition of virtue theory, which is what they're trying to do, that's really doesn't make any sense, that you can't really understand a particular character trait or virtue outside of the context of all the other potential virtues, that they're correlated with one another, right? So and I think a good example of this is illustrated within the humanistic tradition. And that's Carl Rogers, and Rogers' Necessary and Sufficient Conditions for Therapeutic Change. And I know you all are familiar with that, right? I mean, you can think of those 4 qualities of the therapist as virtues. So what are they? Anybody want to chime in? What are the 3 necessary and sufficient? David? You have to unmute. Can you unmute?
Yeah, well, I studied with Carl Rogers.
Oh, did you? Wonderful.
That just gives my age away. But anyway, yeah. So we start with there's genuineness. Genuineness is the therapist is aware of their own experience in a non-defensive way. They're have empathic understanding of the client's experience, and they communicate that effectively to the client, and they have the unconditional positive regard, a warm prizing of the client. So there's, genuineness, empathy, unconditional positive regard, and usually the theory of change includes a client that's incongruent. That's the sort of basic idea that if the client brings a state of incongruence, those factors of the client perceiving those factors in the therapist will lead to the transformation of the client's personality.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you, David. That's wonderful. Beautiful articulation of the necessary and sufficient conditions.
Thank you.
From a student of Carl Rogers. So that's awesome. So very honored to have you here.
Happy to be here.
So yeah, Rogers has been a big influence on me and my approach to therapy. But I think Rogers I don't think ever referred to those necessary and sufficient conditions as virtues, but I think they fit that concept, right? Because genuineness can be understood as this kind of way that we comport ourselves, right? In a dispositional kind of way, and it requires, a kind of, it requires work. You know what I mean? You don't just, you have to work on being genuine. It's not something that's necessarily automatic, especially if we've been exposed to some, toxic kind of relationships in our lives. And where there's a lack of congruency and a lack of genuineness. So an achievement of genuineness is an achievement. It's a kind of virtue. It's something that takes some work to cultivate. Some of us have been, and even Aristotle talks about luck. There's an element of luck. Like if you had really good parents and genuineness comes easy to you, well, you're just lucky. Some of us are lucky, some of us aren't. We had shitty parents, or we have shitty relationships. We grow up in school with a bunch of bullies or whatever. Or maybe we're in conditions that are impoverished that require people to be inauthentic in order to survive, and so we have to work our way out of that. So genuineness is a kind of a virtue, but I think it's interesting that I started thinking about how you really need all 3. If you just had 1 or 2 of those character strengths without all 3, it wouldn't necessarily be healing. So I was thinking about how sociopaths can be empathic in a weird kind of way, in the sense that people who are really good at manipulating others and getting over on others are really good at perspective taking. In other words, they can put themselves in the perspective of their victims as a way of figuring out how to, manipulate them, how to influence them. But of course, as a sociopath, you would lack unconditional positive regard for your victim, right? So empathy, in order to be healing, requires unconditional positive regard. But if you have empathy and unconditional positive regard without genuineness, then that in itself can feel kind of manipulative or fake, and might not have an impact, right? Because if you're not seen as someone who's transparent, and then a person isn't necessarily going to believe you when you affirm them, right? So in a way, you need all 3 of those character traits together in order for it to be healing. And I think that's kind of the idea here, is that I think that positive psychology fails to appreciate the holistic way that you need to understand character traits and virtues in order to understand how they come to be virtues. So I'll leave it at that. But I would like to, at this point, before I move on and talk about the joyful life, just open it up to any questions or comments that people have. Just take a few minutes to check in at the top of the hour. If anybody feels like they want to, if not, then I can move on. Okay, so I'll go ahead, since we don't have any comments or questions now, I'll go on because we're going to do an experiential exercise, and I think that will generate a lot of opportunities for discussion. So let me lay out what I mean by the joyful life and how it's drawing from these traditions. So it's a conception of the good life, and it's an attempt to develop a conception of the good life that's grounded in these existential, humanistic, and spiritual traditions. In addition to being based in a phenomenological inquiry where we ground descriptions in lived experience, and I'm also trying to think about it as a kind of consummate experience, as a kind of bringing together different ways of understanding happiness into a more complete vision of the good life. And I have to say that with some humility, again, that's a value-laden claim, right? This idea of a consummate or a higher level of happiness. And I'm admitting that. This is guided by my own values, by my own traditions of understanding, and by my own culture. And I'm just, I'm not apologizing for that. I'm just being open and transparent about that. And you're welcome to be critically engaged, and you don't have to agree. You can offer a different perspective. And I'd love to hear about it. But the vision here is a kind of consummate experience of well-being based on a more enduring sense of joy that isn't dependent on particular fleeting circumstances or momentary pleasures, that involves a kind of self-transcendence, a kind of losing of oneself in a certain sense, a breaking down of the ego, and an openness to an ethical other. And that's more in line with what Paul Wong has called a meaning orientation, where joy is an existential and spiritual fruit, both of character development, but also that doesn't avoid suffering, that actually is a kind of wisdom that comes through a kind of willingness to bear and to work through unavoidable suffering in the way Viktor Frankl talks about it in his work. The aim is not to accumulate a lot of subjective pleasure, right, as an end in itself, but to be aimed toward transcendent and intrinsic goods. So here, you would really be counterproductive from my perspective if you were doing therapy and you set as an outcome, your outcome of therapy is gonna have more joy in life. You know what I mean? I think that would be problematic. That could be experienced as really kind of oppressive. But instead, the focus should be on living a good life, living a meaningful life. And that really a byproduct of that, if you do that, then probably a byproduct of that would be a kind of joy. But when joy becomes an end in of itself, it threatens to become something like a more fleeting, hedonic kind of pursuit. This is, I think, something very paradoxical. So I've in other words, like, joy is something that is an end that we want to, in a certain sense, that people want to strive towards. But when it becomes the focus of our attention, ironically, that tends to interfere with our achievement of it. There's a sort of forgetting that has to happen in joy that I think is really interesting and paradoxical. And I'll just leave it at that. I think that in itself is a really interesting problem in all of this research. And again, very much in line with the existential tradition, joy is not about avoidance. It's more consistent with a kind of radical acceptance within the mindfulness traditions, where it's not about avoiding suffering, but engaging with our suffering in an authentic, genuine way in order to grow as a person and to discover meaning through that suffering. It's also not about a masochism where we want to, we want to have more suffering in our life or something like that. It's about the unavoidable suffering, not a kind of masochism. Okay, so that's an outline of how I'm thinking about joy. And I want to talk a little bit about the science of joy that's preceded me, and I'm going to go very quickly through this. But generally, joy in the research literature on emotion has been understood as a basic emotion, meaning it's universal to the species. It's believed to have evolved to meet certain survival functions. We find it early in development, and we see it connected with certain species typical behavior patterns, especially certain facial expressions, but also certain bodily expressions as well. We see joy early in development. Social smiles appear within the first month of life. And there seems to be several functions of this early manifestation of state joy. It seems to be connected to communication and to engagement with others. So if you've ever interacted with a baby, right, who smiles, there's an exchange of smiles and gestures between parent and child, or between the adult and the child. That is a form of communication, even before words, right? And also we see it when children are mature enough to use toys or to master certain kinds of objects, like stacking blocks on top of one another. We start to see a kind of joy that erupts out of a sense of achievement. So Aksan and Kochanska highlight this in their two-factor model of joy, that there's social forms of joy and then non-social forms of joy that are more about mastery or achievement. In terms of species typical facial expressions and bodily expressions, many of you may be familiar with the work of Paul Ekman and the wonderful work he's done on facial expressions across culture. And so he identified what's called a Duchenne smile, which is it's the giveaway when somebody is engaged in an authentic smile as opposed to an inauthentic smile. So when you go to a fast food joint and somebody smiles because their manager is standing behind them, telling them that they're supposed to smile, and they're really not feeling it, but they have to smile because it's their job, that's not a Duchenne smile. That's the fake smile. But it turns out that you can tell the difference between the two. You can tell the difference between a genuine smile and a non-genuine smile. So I'd be interested to see if you can pick out whether A or B is the Duchenne, the authentic Duchenne smile. David? I can't hear it. Can you unmute?
I would say B is the Duchenne smile, but I could be wrong.
Yeah, no, you're right. It's B. Yeah, B is the Duchenne smile. And the key is the muscles around the eyes. The muscles around the eyes are involuntary. You can't fake the muscles around the eye. You can manipulate the muscles around the jaw in order to create a fake smile, but the dead giveaway is the eyes. It's interesting, people say the eyes are the seat of the soul, things like that. Something that may have something to do with the fact that a lot of the muscles around our eyes are involuntarily express our emotional states. Okay, some other interesting research. Joseph de Rivera, by the way, de Rivera has been involved in Division 32 as well. And he did some seminal research on joy back in 1998. It's quantitative. And he defines joy as a realization or actualization of the self, very, very humanistic, very Maslow. And that he says the person experiences his, or we should add her, existence as meaningful, as coming closer to the self that he or she really is. He says it's kind of an attitude of let it be. This is very Heidegger too. I hear a lot of, Heidegger talks about Gelassenheit, this way of thinking as a kind of recollection of being, as a kind of openness to being. That kind of joy that Heidegger talks about, that's an openness to being, would be more along these lines. He says that joy also occurs when there's a mutual meeting between the person and another, in which the other is perceived as unique, and that it functions to affirm the meaningfulness of life. All this is very consistent with what I've said and what Paul Wong has said. Interestingly, he's found some quantitative evidence that joy can be distinguished from elation and gladness. That he says elation is really about elation, gladness are goal orientations. They're about specific outcomes. So in elation, it's about unexpected attainment of a fantasized goal, and the gladness is the expected attainment of a goal. This is, I think, really interesting because it's found some sort of quantitative confirmation of that distinction that Heidegger makes. Heidegger would probably be scandalized saying that quantitative research would in some way validates his ontology. But there's something consistent here in that when Quentin Smith makes that distinction between joy as a kind of existential mood and gladness as an existential authentic mood, and gladness or happiness as an inauthentic mood, right? That's about a particular entity. There's something here where elation and gladness are more inauthentic. They're about a particular outcome or goal, whereas Derrida is finding that joy isn't about necessarily any particular entity, except maybe a connectedness to others. Okay, so very broadly, I'm going to go over some recent advances in empirical research on joy. Emmons, in a paper that was in a special issue of Joy in Journal of Positive Psychology, he says that joy's distinction from hedonic well-being may lie in its tendency to emerge as a response to a solicitation from something larger than ourselves. Again, this idea of a transcendence. It's about communion with others, a deeper, more engaged life. Watkins, Graves, and Bell found evidence that state and trait gratitude were positively related with state and trait joy. That's consistent with that theme of joy as a kind of reception of being as a gift, right? A sense of fortunateness as being at the heart of joy. Watkins and colleagues also in their quantitative study found that joy operated as a distinct positive emotion. They developed their own quantitative measure scale, measuring state and trait joy. At the same time, I was developing mine. Meadows in 2014 talks about some hallmark phenomenological dimensions of joy, one being a sense of harmony or unity, and that this is correlated with a sense of energy, potency, and aliveness, a pleasant or rewarding experience, having a sense of the transcendent, meaning a shift out of ordinary experience, a shift out of ordinary experience of time, space, and or the past, and also changes in perception of vision and motor movement. So there's a sense of expansion of visual perception and an expansive sense of movement. And then Watkins develops a theory of a distinct appraisal pattern in joy that he thinks distinguishes it from other emotions. And he thinks the key here is a closer connection to another person or a project that's deemed important, valuable, or good. This sounds more like gladness, right, in the Heideggerian sense than joy. So that's an interesting debate to be had there. Okay, so and then I have to spend a little bit of time talking about the humanities, because humanistic psychology, one of the things we do is we don't just draw upon the empirical sciences, but we draw upon the humanities. And I could talk a lot about how joy emerges within literature, within fiction and poetry, but I want to focus on one particular poem that's been meaningful to me in contemplating the phenomenology of joy, and that's William Blake. Just a very simple, poem where he says, "He who bends to himself a joy doth the winged life destroy, but he who kisses the joy as it flies lives in eternity's sunrise." So I wonder if anybody would feel an inclination to offer their understanding of what this poem is saying. What does this tell? If Blake is right, if he's tapping into something true about joy, what is it that he's trying to communicate here? He's obviously using a metaphor, right? For me, a butterfly comes to mind, maybe a bird. He says winged life. But in what way does this butterfly or bird or winged being stand in as a metaphor for joy in this particular poem? David?
It seems like the idea in Buddhism of non-attachment. I mean, if you're trying to control, this bird or butterfly, and sort of need to have that contact, then you're obviously going to, in some way, have a oppressive relation towards that which you are attached to or need in an obsessive kind of way. So if you appreciate it, that's what it seems like Blake is saying. If you appreciate it and just allow it to be sort of the blessing that it is, then you're, better off probably.
Beautiful. Yeah. Anybody else want to chime in there? That's beautifully said. Thank you, David.
One of the things that struck me there is this idea of searching for something and wanting something, and the more you search for something, the less likely you perhaps are to achieve it. So kind of a bit of a paradox there, that you're looking for joy, but the more you look for it, the more you try and have it, perhaps the less likely you are to achieve it.
Yes, yeah. So I mentioned that one of my operating assumptions is this paradox that seems at the heart of joy. When we seek joy as an object, it seems to destroy the possibility of joy. But when we're pursuing something that's transcendent of ourselves, of a good, that's not an emotional state, but something that's beyond ourselves, and really a pursuit of meaning is the way Paul Wong talks about it, then joy is sort of a byproduct of that. But when joy becomes the object, we kind of kill it. I think Blake sort of seems to be talking about something like that paradox. I think that paradox is also kind of there in Heidegger, right? When he says, when we try to understand being, with a capital B, on the ontological, right? The existence itself, our tendency is to want to transform it into a being with a small b, an entity, right? And he's saying that sort of, as soon as we do that, we're engaged in a metaphysics that forgets being. And if joy is a kind of openness, a kind of authentic receptivity to being, then transforming it into an entity, right? Make it, it's almost like a kind of idolatry, of the ontological. Then we kind of destroy it. It's I think there's an interesting parallel there in Heidegger too. Anybody else have any comments on this? Anything you're taking away from Blake?
I think, Brent, Elizabeth might have had a comment. I'm not sure if you still do.
Oh, okay.
And then also there's one that we could read from Brett that's in the chat. Okay.
Could you go ahead and read that? Because, oh wait, sure. I got the chat up. Okay, so Matt said his audio is not working.
Oh, no, that one. Matt's back with us. Brett Baldwin here that said, seems like joy is something to be thankful for as it passes in life rather than something to be pursued.
Right. Beautiful. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And this makes it really difficult to study. I mean, I think you could maybe even make an argument that maybe joy is impossible to study, that as soon as we transform it into an object of investigation, we're always in danger of killing it, so I'm in a very dangerous endeavor here, folks. I'm trying to study something that can't be studied. And I think it's important that we're aware of that. But that doesn't mean we can't study it. I think it means that we have to be aware that there's a danger here, that of appropriating joy in a particular way that systematizes it and objectifies it and kills it. And we don't want to do that. All right. So with that, I think I'm going to do the tightrope walk of now trying to deal with this paradox, right? And the way I'm trying to study it is phenomenologically initially, right? This goes back to my dissertation. I published the results in 2006 in Connie Fisher's book, Qualitative Research Methods for Psychologists, if you're interested in reading that, or just email me at brobbins@pointpark.edu and I can send you any of this stuff. So what about the experience of state joy? Well, I used a phenomenological method. There are limitations I found to interviews. And I think this is really interesting because it goes back to this paradox. I found that when I asked people to describe joy, like, tell me about a time when you experienced joy. That was my interview question. I got very impoverished responses. They were very anemic, thin descriptions. They weren't really, there wasn't a lot to go on. And I found qualitatively in my experience with the interviewees that it was a struggle. They found it hard to find the words to describe it. There was almost something ineffable about the experience of joy that made it difficult to articulate. I thought that maybe one way of understanding this is a kind of state-dependent memory kind of problem, that when you're asking people to describe this sort of ecstatic experience of joy, but you're asking them to do it in a kind of interview setting, it's hard to reconnect to that original experience. So I was interested in trying to find a method that would get people into the mood itself, right? To re-experience it and vividly relive it in a way that could then be articulated. And I also thought it was important that we used a method that would give people license to use neologism and figurative language and metaphor, because if we're talking about the ineffable, there may not be any words to say the kinds of things that they want to describe. And so I found that a way to do this was through what was originally developed as a therapeutic technique called the imagery and movement method. And basically the idea here is it's getting to an implicit kind of lived meaning and bringing it to explicit articulation. It's more intuitive, it's more embodied, and it draws on metaphor and nonverbal imagery in addition to narrative forms of knowing. And basically what we're doing is a 5-step process. So you start off where literally we get on the ground with pieces of paper and Crayola markers, and then I instruct people to draw an abstract expression of an experience of joy. So in other words, I don't want them to draw like a house tree person, like representational objects, but an abstract expression. So shapes and gestures and color that capture, their lived experience of joy. And to just do that in a very gut intuitive level and see what happens. And then once they do the drawing, then we do a process called mapping, which is where we look very carefully at the drawing, and then the person talks about how the drawing, why the colors and the gestures are representative of joy. So they're bringing what they did very intuitively into a more explicit reflection into language. So think of it very similar to Jenlin's focusing oriented approach, right? Like they're using instead of checking in with their gut sense, they're kind of using their gut sense, but projecting it outward into a drawing and then bringing that into language using metaphor and figurative speech. And there's a playful element to it that I think is really helpful as well, because there's something very playful about the experience of joy, and people get into that spirit. Even using Crayola markers, is a kind of playfulness that I think is helpful for people to get people into that frame of mind. Now, what I found is as people were doing this mapping and they begin to talk about what their drawing is doing, then that tends to give rise to memories, specific memories that relate this experience or in which they had this kind of experience of joy. And then I found it useful to do role play. So to have the person get up and sort of paint the scene for me and show me where were they standing and where was the other person standing, and all this is videotaped. And then once they do the role play, then there's a verbal translation. So they talk about the story. They tell me the story in words. And then once they tell the story, then I have them sit down and write the protocol. So the verbal translation also involves writing down the metaphors that they found useful and the figurative language they found useful for describing the experience. And then all that is used as data. So what I found when I was doing my dissertation is when I just did straight interviews with people, I had very little data to work with. It was not very useful. When I did this imagery and movement method, I had so much data that it took me forever to transcribe everything because the data was so rich and it was very illuminating and helpful. And there was a clarity to it because people had this license to use metaphor. And metaphor, when you're doing phenomenological research, is really instructive. The kind of metaphors people use. Excuse me. So this is a good point for us to try a little experiential exercise. So what I'd like us to do before I get into telling you what I found in other people, I'd like you, if you have access to a piece of paper and a pen, even better if you have some Crayola markers or colors or crayons or something colorful, that would be great. But if you don't, that's okay. But I'd like you to just take a piece of paper, and even just a pen or pencil would be fine, because if you don't have color to express with, you can still express with gesture and shape. So I'd like you to take just a few minutes, maybe about 5 minutes, to take out a sheet of paper and some writing implements. And again, I don't want you to draw a picture of objects or people. This should be an abstract expression of an experience of joy. And just see where your gut takes you, you know, see what comes out of your fingers on state joy. And I can't share with you the original art because I don't have permission to do that. I never got permission to share that art when I did the research back when I did my dissertation. So as an approximation of that, what I did was I just went on Google and I put in image search and I just put joy in, and I saw what images came up, you know, just to be curious. If I put in joy, what kind of artwork or what kind of imagery would sort of pop up. So this is what I found, just to give you sort of a sample of images that are expressive of joy, and see if there's similar themes or similar kind of gestures and colors that came out in your drawings. Oops.
Brent, can you describe the pictures for people who are calling in?
Oh, right. Yes. So here's the pictures. Thank you for reminding me. So the first picture, it looks like the image of palm trees and lots of flora and some fauna beside an ocean where there's sailboats out on a lake, I think, or maybe an ocean or a lagoon. And then there's what looks like angels sort of flying up above in the sky. And the gesture, there's a lot of yellow and blues, and towards the bottom some black that sort of makes the yellows and the blues and the reds really pop out, I think, because of the black down below. And what I'm noticing with these palm trees is a theme that I'm going to talk about, this kind of gesture of up and out that I saw in a lot of people's drawings. And here we have a woman, a nude figure of a woman, sort of electronically produced, with a kind of warm, emanating yellow, I don't know how to describe it, rays coming out from her abdomen. And then a yellow fractal flowing out of her head, and then she's walking on it. It's the best way to describe it. And then in the background, another fractal, like a blue fractal behind her. This one's a little harder to describe. The next one, it's abstract. It looks to me, the best way to describe it is like a very white center, and then with yellow edges that then become red, blue, black, yellow strips in a kind of circular pattern. And it gives me the sense of a kind of luminous glow in the white center of the drawing, of the painting. Another one of a woman sort of standing on a beach by water, and she has her hands raised over her head and is looking at the sun. And then there's some what looks like maybe fern leaves sort of flowing out into the scene from the side. The next one looks to me like sparks, like arcs of sparks that are sort of captured on film in a photograph. And they're yellow and orange in color. Mm-hmm. This is more abstract, but it looks to me like flowers, a sort of abstract depiction of sort of flowers with very pastel kind of colors of pink, red, white, and blue, and some green. Painting of lilies, calla lilies, I think, against a blue background. Again, I noticed this kind of gesture of up and out, which I think is interesting, because I'm going to talk about that. Also the swirl. So I saw that in some of your stuff, the swirl. Fireworks. This just looks like you're in a field of tall grass, and in front of you is sort of this bursting up of the grass that's somewhat obscuring your view of a field and the blue sky on the other side of the plain. There's a child with her arms raised and extended, surrounded by butterflies that look like they're almost sort of bursting out of her. Is the way I would describe it. And they're greens and purples and reds and yellows. Okay, so that gives you some idea of the kinds of drawings that people did, but in this case, using Google instead of the original participants. So what I did is I looked through all this and I looked for common themes that emerged. I wouldn't necessarily say these are essential themes and that all joy must involve all of these, but what I did see is that these were themes among my participants at this particular sample. These were the themes that seemed to cut across the participants. One was this sense of movement. There was a sense of motion, right, where there's a felt movement up and out. And I saw this come out in a couple ways. One is, in some cases, not always, the drawings had this kind of gesture of a up and out kind of motion. In some cases, people talked about it as a feeling in their body, as a warmth moving up and out of their body that was part of that experience, starting at sort of the center of their body. They would describe it just the way I did with that gesture, and that you saw in some of the paintings of this kind of hands opening up and out. So I described that as a kind of felt movement up and out. And along with that, people described a sense of appreciation, a combination of awe, a sense of wonder, gratitude. And it's interesting to see how this sort of links up with some of this correlational research that we've seen linking happiness to a grateful disposition. People talk about a sense of peace and security when they have this feeling. And this may be linked to having a sense of safety or familiarity, being in a stress-free environment. Having a felt sense of being centered or balanced. A warm, powerful, energized feeling moving upward and out of the body toward the world. A sense of expansiveness that goes along with that. Very similar to the way Jonathan Haidt talks about the concept of elevation. He talks about how when we watch other people engage in pro-social acts, like being kind to somebody, you see somebody, helping a person in need, that it can produce this feeling of warmth in the chest. And he actually said there's a physiological component to it, that the heart actually expands, the chambers of the heart actually expands when people have this feeling. And I think that it's what he's describing is very similar to the way people describe the way their chest feels when they're experiencing joy. A feeling of being more connected or closer or intimate with others. This seems to, maybe this helps to explain why we see a very common link between a kind of sense of well-being and extroversion. Maybe people extroverted just spend more time connecting with others and have more opportunities for these kinds of emotions in interpersonal situations. The other theme I had trouble articulating, and I think there's a couple different ways to try to get at it. One is a kind of non-instrumental mode of being. What I mean by that is they're not trying to accomplish a particular goal. It's not like gladness or elation. Like it's not orientation to a particular object, similar to the way William Blake talks about joy. It's really intrinsically motivated. The moment itself, the joyful moment in itself is its own end. It's not oriented towards some other end or even perceived as an end of some project. And one way of maybe getting at this is a sense of playfulness, I think it's similar to what Csikszentmihalyi is called flow. Originally, Csikszentmihalyi talked about flow as autotelic, auto self-telic goal. So the activity is its own goal. There seems to be something about joy that is similar. It's autotelic, it's its own goal. There's an altered perception of time and space, a sense of a full, fecund, and eternal present. Radical transformation of the sense of time. And an expansive opening up of felt spatiality, right? A sense of, you know, the space opening up as well as the gesture of opening up and out. And then a nurturing sense of having grown from the experience. People talk about associations to childhood innocence, a sense of nostalgia, a sense that they don't have these experiences as often as they used to or would like to. And then I thought it was interesting, almost all of them were gratitude and were grateful and thanked me for doing this exercise. So that helped me to see that there may be some therapeutic benefit to doing this imagery and movement method, not just as a research technique, but as a therapeutic exercise. Okay, so to triangulate some of this evidence, you know, somebody did a factor analytic study where they found that joy was distinguished from other similar emotions, as I mentioned with De Rivera. We can see the connection with other people theme, the affirmation of meaningfulness of life theme, and how this is different than elation and gladness because it's not about a goal. It's not about achieving a goal or assessing progress toward a goal. It's not goal oriented. It's autotelic. The event is its own intrinsic goal. If anything, you want to stay where you are. I'm going to skip over that because I want to move ahead to talking about trait joy. So I did a similar method using a dialogical phenomenological approach to study dispositional joy. What is it like to live a joyful life using the imagery and movement method? And in this case, it was a little bit different in that I worked with a classroom of students in a qualitative research class. There were 17 students, and they generated 51 narratives that they shared with each other. And we explored in an open sort of dialogical way what were the themes that emerged out of their narratives of what people that they believed had lived a joyful life. So we saw some themes that emerged, and I'm just a quick outline of them here is that we found a way, metaphors. And I found that I kept coming back personally to a kind of agricultural metaphor, you know, like a seed sort of being planted and grounded and breaking open, you know, and that seemed to be a metaphor that seemed to capture some of the gesture of what I was seeing in these narratives. It's a metaphor, so, you know, metaphors, you know, are metaphors, and they have their limits. But it seemed to be illuminating the sort of seed metaphor. It's interesting going back to Rogers, because Rogers originally studied agriculture, and so much of his work sort of draws upon agricultural metaphors as well. So there's a breaking open, right, in an experience of joy. But the breaking open, we found, begins with a kind of sense of being broken, a feeling of vulnerability and loss, where the person experiences a sense of humility and where they're grounded, and this breaking and this being broken opens them up. It's a kind of a shattering of the ego, which opens them up to this transformative experience of joy where they experience courage and empowerment. They feel centered, they feel uplifted, they're inspired through somebody they admire, and they aspire to something beyond themselves. They become open to the mystery of existence and experience a sense of reverence and awe. And out of that comes an opening it out to something beyond themselves, a kind of self-giving love, an experience of generosity and fecundity. And along with that, a kind of hope or a sense of belonging already within a joyful community, an experience of solidarity with others, and a kind of exchange, a sense of being loved and feeling loved and wanting to give love to others. All of these were themes that kind of emerged in a lot of these narratives. So I'll go through each of these very quickly, but again, the dialogical phenomenological method was developed at Seattle University. So it's a cooperative group dialogue approach to qualitative research. And there were 17 undergraduates. Almost all of them were female, 15 female, 2 males. developing 51 narratives for analysis. So being broken, right? Embracing brokenness. You can connect this to existential finitude, guilt, radical acceptance. We can connect up some of this theme to post-traumatic growth, a trauma that kind of shatters our faith in an assumptive world, but then a process of coming to a new understanding of meaning and purpose out of that tragedy. And then a breaking open, a shift from being self-centered to self-transcendent. I think of Groundhog Day with Bill Murray, right? Remember that he's this very self-centered person, but in this process, he's sort of broken. He goes through experience where he literally commits suicide over and over again. He goes through a kind of ego death and then becomes oriented toward the other, the ethical other. We can link this up to research in mindfulness, for example, and compassion seems to be an important component in joy. A feeling of being centered, experience of having courage and being empowered. I love this kid with his power stance. It represents for me this sense of being grounded and also being backed up, right? You can't be empowered by yourself. You need to have a community to sort of back you up. The experience of fidelity and humility. Fidelis comes from faithful, true, being rooted in the soil of a tradition or practice. Appropriating one's duty as one's own is the way Heidegger talks about it. I think of, like for example, in Buddhism, grounding oneself within the practice of meditation, for example, or maybe in other spiritual traditions, like a prayer or meditation that might be peculiar to different traditions. A sense of humility, humus from the earth, is a kind of being grounded, right? Awareness of one's limits and being planted again within a kind of tradition or practice. It seems important. Being uplifted. My colleague Robert McInerney has done some beautiful research on this, how in order to aspire to something great, we have to be inspired. And he uses the metaphor of the breath. You have to inspire and you aspire. You breathe in, you breathe out. And it's important to have models, to have someone to identify with and to support us, to have mentors. And being open to the mystery, the reverence and awe piece. I think it's interesting to explore this in connection to the stuff we talked about on Heidegger. Joy as an appreciation of the isness of being, anxiety as a kind of fear of the is not inherent in being, and awe as an appreciation of what may not have been, and gratitude as an appreciation of that which might not have been but is. All of that seems to be sort of wrapped up in joy in one way or another. Opening up and out, self-giving love, experience of generosity and fecundity are themes that come up here. Gratitude is an appropriate response, it seems, to reverence and awe. Offering a gift of oneself seems to be appropriate response of gratitude. I'm grateful for what's been given to me, so I want to give back to others. So out of that comes a kind of generosity and fecundity, and along with that can come along with that is a sense of boundless energy and resources. And then the joyful community. I think of beloved community in Martin Luther King, or Max Shaler's person community, where he talks about moving from an evolution of kind of the crowd or the herd to the individual, to an integrated person community, where that's more like King's beloved community, where there's a sense of mutuality, that my well-being is contingent on your well-being and everyone else's well-being. We sink or fall together. All right, so that's the qualitative research, and then I'm aware we're getting very close to the end of time. So I want to just talk about some of the quantitative research I've been doing very quickly. So I took some of this qualitative research and we began to develop a trait measure of joy that was inspired by some of this qualitative research. And we define joy as a dispositional attitude by which joy is affirmed despite the circumstances of one's life. So it's this enduring disposition despite one's circumstances that we've seen throughout the existential, humanistic, and spiritual literature. And we looked at 235 individuals who were recruited from an urban liberal arts college and through social media, and they filled out the forms through SurveyMonkey. There were 175 female and 60 male participants, ranging in age from 18 to 65 and older. These are the demographics. I'm not going to go over all of them, but it's a pretty diverse sample. heavy on the single, a lot of agnostics and atheists, probably because of all my existential connections. And but a good representation of Buddhism and Protestant Christians and Catholics. Not quite as many Muslim and Jewish. I think that's a deficit in the sample here. And here is the initial joyful life scale. I'm not going to read these all to you, but just you can see some of the items. If something bad happens, it won't ruin my day. In a job I dislike, I can still remain content. I consider myself a joyful person. What are some other ones? Despite what may happen to me, I'm able to maintain a sense of well-being. Joy is possible even during times of suffering, right? So you have this sense of enduring joy is really the focus of the scale. And we found that when we did a confirmatory factor analysis, that 9 items loaded on a single component, and we reduced the 19 items to the 9 items. And then participants rated their agreement with items on a 7-point Likert scale from 7, strongly disagree, to 1, strongly disagree. And we found that the results had a Cronbach's alpha of 0.92, which is very strong inter-item reliability. So that's good. We looked at this scale in relation to other measures of well-being, satisfaction with life scale, which looks at global cognitive judgments about life satisfaction, subjective happiness, and then the Bradford scale of psychological well-being, which is the relation of positive and negative affect. And then we looked at the Big 5 inventory, which is a measure of extroversion, agreeableness, conscientiousness, neuroticism, and openness. And then we also looked at some other dispositional instruments, the dispositional positive emotion scale, awe subscale, which is a measure of dispositional awe, the gratitude questionnaire, the short index of self-actualization, and the material value scale, which looks at how important possessions are in one's life. So these were our main findings. We found that the joyful life scale was significantly related to 3 dimensions of the Big 5. It was positively related to extroversion, moderately and positively related to agreeableness, and positively and negatively related to neuroticism. Pretty strong, for a psychology study, pretty strong negative correlation there, 0.61. And then we found that the JLS, as predicted, was positively and significantly related to the measures of well-being, so satisfaction with life, state happiness scale, and the positive to negative affect ratio scale were all, as expected, positively related. Joyful life scale was also correlated positively with the awe measure and gratitude, as well as self-actualization. So all of these show that the scale predicted what it was supposed to predict. That it was correlated with the things that we thought it would be correlated with, but not so highly correlated that it's indistinguishable. So it has discriminant validity as well as predictive validity. And then we also looked at religious belief, and we found that on average, participants with religious belief scored significantly higher on the joyful life scale than those with non-belief. So that was connected up to some of the religious themes that we've seen in some of the research. In terms of variance in Big 5, we found that when we did a multiple regression analysis with all the well-being measures, the joyful life scale accounted for most of the variance in neuroticism, conscientiousness, and self-actualization, whereas satisfaction with life predicted most of the variance in openness, awe, gratitude, and material values. And then on average, participants with religious beliefs scored significantly higher on the JLS than those with non-belief. I think I mentioned that already, didn't I? And then, yeah, sorry about that. I don't know why those repeated. Okay, so, and then one more study, and then I'll end, and I can answer any questions that you might have. Whoa, I don't know what's happening here. So we did a cold presser study. So for this study, we use a technique called the cold presser, where a person immerses their hand in ice. And it's an ethical and safe way of measuring pain tolerance, or pain, the experience of pain. And so we had people take the joyful life scale and also a hope measure. They took, and then some demographic information. Then we took their blood pressure And then they did the cold presser task. They immersed their hand in sub-freezing temperature, and they were to keep it in there as long as they could, but no longer than 4 minutes. And then we measured the time that they had their hand immersed, and then we took their blood pressure after the cold presser task. And this is right now it's a small sample that we're still collecting data on this, but I have 35 students who participated, and I can report on preliminary findings, which are, even with a small sample, we're seeing significant results already. So that's exciting. So our hypothesis was that the higher the joyful life scale is, that the longer the time of voluntary immersion in the cold presser. So that's an operational definition of pain tolerance. And then we also predicted that joyful life, higher scores on the joyful life scale would have less impact on blood pressure after the cold pressure task as compared to before the task. So this is an operational definition of physiological resiliency to pain. So what we found is that the joyful life scale did not predict time in the cold presser, but it was positively related with state joy. And this was the big finding, that the joyful life scale did predict less change in diastolic blood pressure after the cold presser task as compared to before the cold presser task. So even with just 35 participants, not a lot of power there, we're still collecting data. The preliminary results seem to be pointing to the fact that joyful life scale might indicate some dispositional resiliency to the physiological impact of pain, at least when it comes to diastolic blood pressure. So some conclusions here. The phenomenological study of dispositional joy does suggest that this is a way of understanding the good life that's consistent with the meaning orientation and a consummate conception of the good life. It integrates hedonic, prudential, eudaimonic, and chironic themes. Obviously, it's a pleasurable experience. People are actively engaged, but they seem to be oriented toward more pro-social types of activities. And there's this deeper existential and spiritual dimension to it that brings together all of those visions of the good life into a single conception. And then the quantitative measure, which is, in humanistic psychology, sometimes we have to use the master's tools that gets people to pay attention to what we're doing. That's kind of what I feel like we're doing here. So the joyful life scale does appear to be a reliable and valid measure of dispositional joy. And it does predict differences in personality and material values and religious beliefs. And it might predict physiological resiliency in response to pain in laboratory conditions. And if that's the case, then it would be interesting to see if it might have some clinical applications. So for example, in chronic pain, it might have some clinical applications for building physiological resiliency to chronic pain. And joyful life may be a way to operationalize a conception of happiness that's more grounded in an existential, humanistic, and spiritual set of traditions. Directions for future research. I think we need more qualitative research with more diverse and larger participant pool. We need more cross-cultural work. All of this has been done in North America. The joyful life scale can also test hypotheses that have been generated from the qualitative research, and I'll just give you a list. I'm not going to read all through them, but these would be some of the things that I would like to study, and I hope other people will study using our measure. Will joyful life scale correlate with mindful attention, compassion or agapic disposition, moral integrity, ego integrity, post-traumatic growth, dispositional humility and courage, et cetera, et cetera? I think some of the qualitative research suggests maybe some of these hypotheses might be worth pursuing. So I will end there because I think we're out of time, but I will take some questions. Is it okay if we take a few questions, Vanessa? Or are we really pressed for, do we have to end?
No, we don't have to end right on time. I am going to end the recording here.
Okay.